Welcome to this set of videos on the miracles of Jesus. Getting an understanding of these miracles is important because Jesus didn't present his truth, his reality, by words alone. He balanced his words with actions. And of these actions, the miracle tradition is the most important. The reality is that the miracle tradition of the New Testament rattles the modern mindset. We're not used to talking about signs, wonders, or miracles. But this was one of the earliest traditions within the Christian community. The stories of Jesus as a miracle worker predated the writing of the Gospels. The importance of this tradition is seen if we look at Mark's Gospel, for example, which is essentially built around the miracle stories of Jesus. But there is a very important question. When we're talking about the miracles of Jesus, we can ask, did they happen exactly the way they are portrayed in Scripture? Let me rephrase the question. Should we read the miracle stories in a naive or literalistic fashion? Now, to answer those questions, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to cover several different perspectives on the issue, and I'll be very interested to know what you think. So let's look at historical criticism. What does that say about the gospel miracle stories? Modern historical criticism, so applying critical techniques from critical history, indicates that we can have some issues with taking literally the miracle stories of Jesus. Let me highlight a few of those problems. First, literary criticism notes that in the Gospels themselves, there's a tendency to amplify the miracles. That's one way of putting the point. What does that mean? In Mark chapter 1 verse 34, Jesus heals many sick. But in the parallel text in Matthew 8:16, he doesn't heal many sick, he heals them all. In Mark's Gospel, the daughter of Jairus is near death. In the corresponding text in Matthew, she's already dead. So let's compare the two texts. In Mark 5, one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death." In Matthew 9, we read, "While he was saying these things to them, an official came forward, knelt down before him and said, 'My daughter has just died, but come lay your hand on her, and she will live.'" So, literary critics would say that Mark's Gospel came first, and Matthew's Gospel, which adopted the material of Mark, used that material and amplified the miracles. To give another example, in Mark's Gospel we have the feeding of the 4,000 with 7 baskets of leftovers. In Matthew's Gospel that becomes 5,000 people with 12 leftover baskets. So literary critics will argue that there's amplification occurring in the Gospels, and this amplification probably occurred in the oral traditions before the Gospels. We also find interesting comparisons with miracle stories that we see in the rabbinic and Hellenistic traditions. So the rabbis were the teachers of Israel, and the Hellenist, that's from the word for Greek, so the Greek pagan miracle workers. We find rabbinic and Hellenistic stories of miracle cures, casting out demons, raising people from the dead, and calming storms. So it seems that the miracle stories of Jesus, at face value at least, run parallel to other stories of miracles from the time. And so it's argued that New Testament writers included the miracle stories of Jesus to emphasize his greatness and also his authority. They would also argue that we can't dismiss the rabbinic and Hellenistic miracle stories while taking the New Testament stories of Jesus seriously. One thing I'd note though immediately though is that even though historical critics will compare the miracles of Jesus to rabbinic and Hellenistic miracle stories, there are significant differences. Firstly, Jesus did not perform miracles for money or for other sorts of rewards. He also did not use the miracles to punish people or to make a show of himself. As a point of reflection, we might think of the so-called miracle workers that we see today on television. Like the Hellenistic miracle workers of the time of Jesus, you see people on television who will perform alleged miracles to draw attention to themselves and to make money. But is that what Jesus did? There's no record of Jesus seeking payment for his services. And most certainly, Jesus didn't use the miracles to draw attention to himself. In fact, quite the opposite. He would tell people to tell no one. Form criticism, which is another part of historical criticism, also argues that some of the miracle stories are actually projections of the experience of the followers of Jesus, the projections of their experience of Jesus after the resurrection back into the earthly life of Jesus. So when we have the calming of the storm, the feeding of the crowd, and the transfiguration, these miracle stories, it's alleged, are saying that Jesus is the Lord of life and nature, and that these miracle stories actually are more about the experience of the followers of Jesus after his resurrection. How do we put this point in other words? Form critics would say that the miracles are stories inserted into the Gospels that don't speak of events that actually happened, but stories that express the faith of people who had experienced Jesus as risen. So historical criticism raises some interesting questions about the miracle stories. Historical critics argue that we can't take the stories literalistically because of the way that the stories were edited, amplified, what their source or form was. But does that mean the miracles didn't happen? Does that mean they are a complete fabrication? I think if you take that position, we find a couple of problems. Firstly, it would have been impossible for the Gospels to record miracles of Jesus if Jesus had not established a reputation as a miracle worker. So when the evangelists wrote the Gospels, they wrote stories that resonated with people who knew the story of Jesus, either people who were there or people who were close to people or people who'd heard of the reputation of Jesus as a miracle worker. So if I could put it this way, the miracle stories that we read in the Gospels resonated with the experience and knowledge of the people of the time. Secondly, there's a form of criticism of the Gospels called positive hermeneutics. It looks at elements such as embarrassment or surprise. This positive hermeneutic says we should take very seriously and probably accept as authentic the miracle stories that have no parallels in Jewish or Hellenistic literature, or which have some sort of element of embarrassment or perhaps scandal. Take, for example, the Sabbath healings. Jesus healed on the Sabbath, which led him into conflict with the Jewish authorities of the time. Positive hermeneutics would say such a story is potentially or actually embarrassing. So what motivation would people have to include an embarrassing story in the Gospels? The same would be with the element of surprise. If something is completely unparalleled or unprecedented, then it's a story that we should take very seriously. Let's go back to embarrassment. Jesus cast out demons, but that was controversial. And at the time, Some of the authority says he casts out demons by the power of demons. That was something that was potentially embarrassing or scandalous to the Christian community. So here's the question. What is the motivation for inventing a story that would get you into trouble? What's the motivation for inventing a story that would cause embarrassment to the followers of Jesus? There are some advocates of historical criticism who would say that their scholarship would eliminate the possibility that the miracles of Jesus were historical. I think that's taking things too far. Even if we take historical criticism to its logical conclusion, I think we find a position in which the authors of the Gospels, the contemporaries of Jesus, certainly believed and affirmed that he performed actions that were extraordinary and caused wonder in his contemporaries. So I think it's too far to use scholarship to completely eliminate the miracle tradition of Jesus. On the other hand, I think it's also taking things too far in the other direction to say that we should read these stories with a 21st century mindset that applies a literalistic and naive mindset to the reading of those stories. As we've seen, there are nuances, there are differences in the gospel. Was it the feeding of the 4,000 or the 5,000? Was the daughter of Jairus near death or after death? So I think the answer to all this is a matter of balance between the extremes of absolute disbelief and naive literalism is the balanced perspective on the miracle tradition of Jesus.